They had the worst of starts, didn't they, the Irish Free State. Having said that, they were an incredibly cohesive and strong democracy. If you think about what had happened to Ireland throughout that revolutionary period, from the Easter Rising, the War of Independence, and then the Civil War. During that interwar period, many new democracies collapsed. They didn't survive. Ireland did.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. Now today I'm discussing the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, which was an important event during the Irish Revolution. Now this revolution was a complicated one, but it is hugely important when understanding the relationship between Britain, the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland today. The treaty was an important step in establishing Northern Ireland, and it also, to quote Michael Collins, the great Irish revolutionary, gave Ireland the freedom to achieve freedom. Again, to quote him after signing the treaty, "I have signed my death warrant." Sure enough, within a year, Collins was dead, one of approximately 2,000 killed during the Civil War. My guest is the journalist and author Gretchen Friemann, who's based in Dublin, and she's written an account of the treaty entitled The Treaty. For many of Irish heritage around the world, and I'm one of them, this should be of interest. Also, in Britain, very few people understand the Irish Revolution, and it isn't taught in schools in England. So I hope you enjoy our chat. It's not an easy subject to rattle off, but Gretchen's book is only 250 pages, and so a great entry point. I've also put some additional resources in the show notes, including a great lecture series from Professor Michael Laffan of University College Dublin. I've also put a link in on a piece by Ronan McGreevy on the Aspects of History website. He's written a new book on an assassination that helped spark the Civil War. If you like the pod, please do subscribe. You can get hold of me on the Twitter at OllieWCQ, and you can get Gretchen at G_Freeman. I hope you enjoy. Gretchen Friemann, welcome to the Aspects of History podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
A pleasure. And we are talking about your book, which came out at the end of last year. So it's still a new book.
Yes.
And it is The Treaty. And the subheading there for our listeners, so that they know what I'm talking about here, it's the gripping story of the negotiations that brought about Irish independence and led to the Civil War. So it's the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. Now, we've just been talking about this actually before we started recording, dear listeners, because the story of the Irish Revolution is not one you can really cover in a quick 5-minute discussion, or even probably in an hour's podcast. So we're going to talk more about the Anglo-Irish Treaty itself, and particularly the characters involved, because there are some really big heavyweight figures on both sides, both the Irish side and the British side. But I think it's probably going to help, Gretchen, to just briefly, and again, we've been laughing about how briefly it can be, but a little bit of background for our listeners, because the majority of my listeners are in Britain, but we've got many in America, and I'm sure they'll have a view, and we do have some in Ireland as well. So no pressure.
Oh God.
We were just talking about there are various Irish Home Rule bills that took place during the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century. But really, the problems probably always, there've been problems throughout Anglo-Irish history. But the Act of Union is probably a good place to start off, isn't it?
Yeah. So that was essentially a defensive agreement, or a defensive move by the British government. And what it meant was that in January 1801, when it took effect, was that Ireland effectively vanished as a independent country. So it became part of the United Kingdom. It became a region, rather, of the United Kingdom. And the Dublin Parliament effectively had voted themselves voluntarily voted themselves. Well, bribes were involved, etc., but they voluntarily voted themselves out of existence. And really, that for the next century, there was just this constant desire to roll back, abolish, to get rid of the Act of Union, and this constitutional issue at the heart of British politics really flared up, I guess, with the Home Rule movement, which Gladstone introduced to Parliament in 1886. And really from that time until the treaty, which was 1921, and then implemented on the 6th of December 1922, this constitutional issue, this sort of deeply problematic constitutional issue, was really always front and centre of British parliamentary politics. And I think what the revolution showed, particularly before the First World War, was that Britain's parliamentary system wasn't really well equipped to deal with such a tricky constitutional issue because Irish nationalists wanted to roll back the Act of Union. They wanted to have a degree of self-governance, and the Protestant population in Ireland didn't want that at all, and particularly stalwart, the nub of the Unionist, loyalist resistance to this Home Rule movement was in Ulster. Yeah, it just really poisoned British politics. Well, certainly from the time that Gladstone submitted it, ripped apart the Liberal Party. They had the second Home Rule reading in 1893. And
just to interrupt you briefly.
Yes.
Irish Home Rule. What did that actually mean?
Well, it effectively meant a limited amount of self-government. You'd be financially dependent to a degree still on London, on the Westminster system. But you would have a degree of, it was sort of a devolution, and a variation of devolution as to what you have now, almost a far more, a weaker version of that initially. What all of this unleashed was a ferocious identity, a clash of identities. I don't know how much you wanted to dwell on this, but really Gladstone approached Home Rule with a sort of messianic energy. I mean, for him, it was a moral imperative to give the Irish some degree of self-government. And you've got to remember that the way that Ireland was ruled was that there was an entrenched Protestant ascendancy in Ireland, and so the Catholic majority of over 80% were always at a disadvantage. And Gladstone wanted to address this. I mean, if you look from 1801 to 1829, I think we were saying earlier that really, before Catholic emancipation, the iniquities within the system were appalling. I mean, sort of Ireland was ruled by a succession of coercive acts. So over the century, that there this movement towards, obviously, that the nationalist movement in Ireland gained traction, but also there was a degree of support among the British at large that thought that there was a justification for Home Rule. It completely divided the Liberal Party, and then you have this situation where ultimately, Conservatives could always crush the Home Rule movement because they had the majority in the House of Lords. But this all fell apart, of course, when Lloyd George and Asquith's government, Lloyd George, Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, when they managed in 1909 to water down the way that the House of Lords could just come in and crush any sort of legislation from the House of Commons. So they weakened the House of Lords. And then once that became apparent that to the loyalist population in Ireland that they might actually have to accept through the parliamentary system constitutionally, they would have to accept Home Rule from Dublin, which for them was just totally anathema. It was this idea that they were going to be run by people that were, in their view, subservient to Rome. So they were just viscerally opposed to this, and this is when you get and bear in mind that also we have Andrew Bernard Law coming in as the leader of the Conservative Party in 1911, and around this time, as it becomes obvious that that the House of Lords dominance over the parliamentary system was going to be weak, and that they were not going to be able to thwart Home Rule as they had previously, then what happens is that you get this increasing militant vein within the unionist movement. And let's just also put on the record that the unionist movement, the description of unionist, really came about because of Home Rule. So you didn't have to say that you were a unionist prior to Gladstone introducing Home Rule, because both parties were unionists. So there was no need to use that description. By 1911, we're really getting this upswing in paramilitarism. We have the formation, or at least the Craigavon mass rally in September 1911 of the Ulster Volunteers, formally formed in 1913. But anyway, we have these marches, and as in opposition to that, again, of course, we have the Irish Volunteers forming. But just to stick with the UVF for the minute, this sort of builds into a crescendo to the point where we have in March 1914, we have the Curragh incident, where officers from the south, Protestant officers from the south, because they were invariably Protestant, were told, look, you need to go up to the north and make sure that they don't take any of these arms. That we need to essentially establish order, and we're trying to push our Irish policy through here. So
and it's probably helpful to just mention, I think, with the British Army, the relationship with Ireland. It's not like, there's still a very strong relationship today with many Irish regiments in the British Army. But back then, it was even more of a close. The British Army was not only manned but also officered by many Irish soldiers, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, that's true. And in many ways, this is always sort of raised as an example of potentially hypocrisy from, because a lot of those recruits ultimately crossed over to the Volunteers, that became the IRA. There's an argument that they opened themselves up to charges of hypocrisy that were previously part of the British Army, then they were fighting for the IRA. But that was part of the empire system. You had to not be part of the army would just be really shooting yourself in the foot. Sorry for the perhaps malapert metaphor there, but it was a way of generating income. And jobs were fairly hard to come by, and so obviously the British Army offered one way of having an income, of making a living. So yes, but in general, the officer class were dominated by the Protestants and the Anglo-Irish ascendancy. So what happened to the Curragh? As I'm sure all your listeners know, effectively the officers, there was an incipient officer rebellion, and so they weren't going to go up. And this Curragh mutiny was followed in April 24th to 25th by the Larne gun running. By this stage, we have about 90,000 enrolled in the UVF. After the Larne gun running, they had about 40,000 rifles. So not enough actually for every UVF member to have a rifle, but really that was at this point, you could see that actually the British parliamentary system was breaking down in Ireland, because now there's effectively an army, an alternative system developing. And really the whole situation didn't come to a head because it was superseded by the outbreak of the First World War. But
it didn't, and the outbreak of the First World War was a huge relief at the time. Yeah. By Herbert Asquith, who actually says, "Oh, we'll now save from the problems of Ulster."
Yeah, absolutely. He wrote to Venetia Stanley and said, "Thank God," kind of paraphrasing there, but effectively that was the sentiment.
With the World War I kind of saving the government from really close to civil war prior to the First World War, we then have attention turns to events on the continent, and the horrors of the First World War and the trenches. At which, by the way, I think quite a significant number of and this is perhaps speaks to the loyalty of certain counties in Ulster to the Union, with the loss of so many soldiers during the First World War. But the Easter Rising is probably the next big event to talk about, would you say, unless I've missed something?
And no, the Easter Rising was absolutely the next big event, and it took the British establishment absolutely by surprise that it happened. And in fact, the majority of the Irish volunteers were against it. A lot of them were thinking, well, we just need an absolute military triumph here. But what happened was the core of the Irish volunteers, really the sort of IRB people led by Pearse, they were the ones that decided, well, we're just going to go for an insurrection anyway. And the Easter Rising has really...
This is a very small minority of people, isn't it, really, ultimately?
Yeah, it was a small minority of people, but it soon became a far wider mass uprising. And the problem was the way that the British reacted to that. They cracked down. They were very, they sort of treated, as they have with all Irish rebellions, by the way, the same could be said of the 1798 rebellion, when anyone suspected was just sort of shot. This has always been a kind of a trend in the way that the British deal with the Irish, that it's sort of in many ways similar to the way that they dealt with other colonies. Ireland wasn't a colony, it was a quasi-colony though, but they were very vicious when it came to suppressing any sign of insurrection or rebellion. And actually the majority of the deaths that were caused during the Easter Rising, they were caused by the British military. But that's not to say that the Irish volunteers didn't also kill civilians. They did, but the Easter Rising has sort of gone down in the popular memory in Ireland as really a clean fight, as the Irish civilians, taking on the might of the British Empire.
And so with the Easter Rising, I guess, really capturing the soul of the Irish people, you have the general election in 1918 where Sinn Féin's very successful.
After the treaty and the Civil War, there was a sense that the revolution it was not completed. And so they were going to take up that fight. And there was this idea that this was the pure fight. This was really what they had been, what the whole movement had been about, and there had been some appalling, invidious compromise, and that really your sacred duty to your nation was to the patriotic duty. The real, genuine patriotic duty was to actually continue the fight that Sinn Féin had started, volunteers in Sinn Féin had started, and that this was the real, genuine sign of patriotism, that you wanted a completely independent Ireland, an Irish republic. And, the Sinn Féin movement was anti-imperialistic. So I guess that's how it relates. But obviously, the Sinn Féin, that whole Sinn Féin party fell apart because once the treaty, we'll get into that, but once the treaty was signed, pretty much every Republican organization, institution fell apart. They all split down the middle. So,
okay.
And Sinn Féin, just to say as well, was a loose umbrella organization, and that was part of its strength and also part of its weakness, its fragility. And interestingly, you could say the same about the Irish Home Rule movement, because again, it was a broad-based movement, and it was a popular movement. But it was a very diverse movement. So it sort of, swept in all, like centuries of various strains of nationalism and people that various groups campaigning for a degree of independence. So in that way, they're a little bit similar. They're both diverse movements, and that diversity is also their weakness. But Sinn Féin in 1917 merged so in 1970 with the merger of the Irish Volunteers with the Sinn Féin organisation, which obviously had been started by Arthur Griffith, but it was actually Eamon de Valera who takes over in 1917, because he's one of the few leaders of the Easter Rising that is still around, and he's seen as sort of the bona fide, genuine article, more so than Griffith, who, but really by this stage, had been, many held him in contempt, actually. Even by 1917, he was sort of seen as too much of a moderate, a bit of a sellout, which is...
he likes a dual monarchy, doesn't he? He's got a dual monarchy idea.
Yeah, he's absolutely keen on taking, accepting the crown under circumstances. Having said that, though, he's quite, he's quite an Anglophobe in many ways. So it's misleading to think of him as being, not wanting this idea that he's not a separatist. He just didn't, and this was the problem with the Sinn Féin movement. I mean, you can't argue the point over whether you were a separatist or not. Everyone agreed with the basic goal that they wanted to be a separatist, a state. They didn't want to be attached in any way to Britain, to Great Britain. But there were disagreements and divergences over how much they were willing to sacrifice and how quickly that goal should be attained and at what cost. And I'm sure we'll come on, but the problem with the 1918 Parliament, or Dáil, is that really they never got a chance to actually debate this in any way. I mean, if you think about it, the Dáil met very few times in only 4 of those meetings, and none later than May 1990, were held in public. So essentially, this is a parliament on the run, making policy on the hoof. So it's a little bit of an echo chamber. And it should be added that the same can be said for the Belfast Parliament, which was, of course, up and running by the time we come to the treaty negotiations. So by the time of the truce, we've actually got 2 parliaments. We've got the counter-state parliament, the Dáil, and then we've got the Belfast Parliament that the King had opened on June 22nd, 1921.
Okay, so we moved to the negotiations. I don't want us to spend too much time on the War of Independence, except to say it was brutal, and
it was brutal. It was awful. Yeah.
Yeah, on both sides. Black and tans, famously by the British. And there were many atrocities committed by the other side as well, weren't there? Are you gonna? Would you say that's fair?
I was going to say there are some historians that would say, well, there's this strange disconnect between the way people view the Easter Rising, which also involved the slaughter of, or the killing of, innocent civilians, and the War of Independence, and then the Civil War. So, you could make the argument, well, weren't they all of a piece? Why should we say the Easter Rising is this clean fight, and the War of Independence, well, that's a little bit difficult, because obviously you've got the Irish killing suspected spies, the assassinations that went on, the atrocities that were perpetrated on both sides. I mean, horrific atrocities on both sides. The sack of Balbriggan, the burning of Cork by the British. If you read through it, it's really, it's quite distressing that. And you were really tainted. If you were black and tan, you were tainted for the rest of your life. No one in Britain really. After the War of Independence, there was just a general feeling of disgust at the way that the British had handled that. And I think a lot of the blame has to be laid at David Lloyd George's door. He shouldn't have allowed it to go on in the way that he did. He turned a blind eye to this to what he wanted to be a police war, but it was a savage guerrilla war, and it still produces conflicted emotions and stirs up strong emotions today. I mean, the Irish don't forget it.
Yeah. Yes, I know what you mean, and I think that's something that the British today are probably not as aware as we should be, actually. So we've now, with the War of Independence has ended, and because there is a truce, and both sides now need to negotiate a treaty. So this is where we pick up your book, or where your book picks up, rather. Although everyone should pick up your book, and so it's probably good to just talk about who was on each side. So we have the British government and and Sinn Féin, don't we?
Yeah, in terms of the delegation on either side. Well, you can just...
And also we should talk about... Sorry, I'm diving in again. No, you can tell me to shut up. And you've alluded to this, is the weakness of the Irish side was that really the plenipotentiaries, the delegates, were not in agreement themselves as to what their ultimate goal was. Although there were realists, and there were those who wanted really to go all the way in a complete cut from Britain and Ireland, and that's also the true of the administration back in Dublin. Is that fair to say?
There were hardliners like Culborough and Austin Stack, who just couldn't stomach the idea of... Before we go on to that, this is why it always gets slightly complicated, but actually Eamon de Valera had convinced, and it was never clear to what extent Culborough and Austin Stack were going to accept this, but he seemed to have convinced them that this idea that of a compromise, external association, could perhaps bridge their desire for an Irish Republic and the British concern for Dominion status and keeping the Irish in the empire and retaining that unity of the empire, because that was really their paramount concern. But just before we get into that, can I just sort of say that after the truce which came into force at the start of July, then Eamon de Valera travelled to London with a delegation, to meet Lloyd George, and he met him alone in Downing Street, in the cabinet room in Downing Street. They didn't bicker or argue, but they didn't really get along, and I guess de Valera was a very different figure to Lloyd George, who was very boisterous, convivial, agile. De Valera was a sort of an ascetic, spare figure, obsessed by formulae and all that type of thing. So there wasn't really a meeting of minds, and I guess perhaps after the ferocity of the War of Independence and the danger of charges of apostasy on either side, I mean, both leaders were concerned about that. There was never really going to be sort of a warm welcome. What we do need to understand is that during those meetings in Downing Street, Lloyd George made it clear that if they didn't accept the crown or the empire, then the alternative was war. So de Valera really had no illusion, really, as to where the red lines were in relation to the British and what they were prepared to do if the negotiations collapsed. So I think we need to hold to have that thought there clearly, because really coercion and the threat of war were absolutely essential in the negotiations and in getting an agreement effectively. And it was really, or who could use the menace of war the most effectively. And I think that it was always the British that could do that, even though the British were terrified about the fact that the IRA were just actually using the truce and the treaty negotiations as an excuse to actually muster their forces again and renew the attack on an even greater scale. But ultimately, the British, they are the superpower, and much as guerrilla warfare had really put them on the back foot. They had never thrown all of their resources at the Irish, and the Irish knew that. It was always really Lloyd George who had the greatest stick, if you like. De Valera has, he has these meetings with Lloyd George, and really the only record that we have of those, and of course they're not reliable really, but they're not gospel, but they actually give us a fair idea of what passed between them, and they're the Francis Stevenson's diaries. So Francis,
yes, who's Lloyd George's secretary, has been having an affair with his wife is in Wales, and he's a terrible man, Lloyd George, by the way, I think.
Oh, I don't know. I love him and hate him. He's a divisive figure, but I don't think there's a temptation to sort of write him off completely. But I think he was an extremely creative and forceful character. Morally, yes, you could, we could say, I think John Maynard Keynes said that he effectively was a moral vacuum, but the truth is,
and you mentioned you wrote in and also in your book, you wrote a good piece for us on Craig's involvement in the treaty negotiations, and I'm sorry to keep on interrupting again, but you mentioned that Craig, when he learned that De Valera had met with Lloyd George alone, Craig says, "You're mad. You needed a witness there."
Yeah, well, so that was recorded. I took that line from Max Aiken's. So you have to. I think I did sort of say you have to caveat with it is Max Aiken's record of events. So Lord Beaverbrook. But yeah, no, I mean it's a great line, isn't it? I really don't think we would have had a treaty in many ways. I mean, it's a sort of ridiculous what if question, but if you didn't have somebody of I guess Lloyd George's deviousness to a degree,
right?
Would you have had a treaty? Probably. I mean, I don't think you would have, but I did once say that to him in a story, and he goes, "Yeah, but so what?" So I agree. Like to an extent, he was, he was the prime minister of the time, and I think that the British had in many ways, they had a great asset in Lloyd George because he managed to, by I think quite devious means, to achieve a settlement. And it was an extraordinary achievement because it looked absolutely, how are you going to reconcile these three opposing factions? How were you going to square this circle that looked almost impossible from the outset?
And Lloyd George's counterpart, Arthur Griffith.
Yeah, the delegations. Yeah.
Well, we don't have to go through each and every one, but the sort of the main players really. Yeah, which Lloyd George, I guess, and Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins, of course.
Yeah, Arthur Griffith had been a sort of fiery journalent, from the turn of the century, and he wasn't a great negotiator, though. He didn't have any experience as a negotiator. So you have to remember that. Whereas, of course, I don't think there was really anyone almost to rival Lloyd George by the time you got to 1921. He'd been through Paris, so many, difficult negotiations at that point. He was really at his peak. But yeah, Arthur Griffith was, he certainly didn't, I mean, it's clear that he was a moderate, and that he didn't want to, he wanted to avoid war if they could, and he was willing to accept the crown if that was what it was going to take. But he was recognised within Sinn Féin as being a moderate by that stage. So his word alone was not going to carry much weight, and that's really the difficulty that happened at that penultimate meeting. When Lloyd George dramatically threatens, there'll be immediate and terrible war within 3 days, and all the rest. So he needed effectively all of the Irish delegates to sign. So Arthur Griffith, yes, he's moderate, and they sort of had to try and establish which of the delegates were going to be amenable to a negotiation or to an agreement and which weren't. So there was some confusion as to whether Collins was really a hardliner or not. It turns out actually that he was always sort of inclined towards moderation, at least towards some sort of compromise. And again, I think Collins was quite pragmatic about it in a way, because the idea of having to renew the war with limited resources, and if the British were to throw everything that they had at the Irish, that was going to be very difficult for Collins, especially after the truce, when sort of the whole everyone had been sort of flushed out, and he was never going to be able to return to that position of being, sort of under the radar, and able to. He was always protected. He got the reputation in the end of a sort of a Scarlet Pimpernel who could disappear without trace, and always elude the Crown forces. I mean, Collins was always the more charismatic figure, and there was absolutely no way that, again, you could not have Collins as part of that delegation. So, of course, there's a ferocious argument in Dublin, and of course, down the decades, who should have been part of that delegation? De Valera, right? So why wasn't he part of the delegation? But there's a lot of sort of myth attached to De Valera having thrown Michael Collins to the wolves, made him, sort of put him in this precarious position, and his whole strategy was there to undermine him. But you have to remember as well that Michael Collins was Minister of Finance, and he was also the president of the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, that was sort of at the core of the IRA. And so there wasn't going to be any agreement without him agreeing to it. There was no point in actually striking any sort of deal if you didn't have the representative of the soldiers, if you like, of the fighters. So Collins, he had various hats to wear, and he sat on so many of the subcommittees. But apart from any of that, I mean, he really was he seemed to actually get on with some of the British negotiators. So he didn't really like Lloyd George or Churchill, but he did get on with F.E. Smith and Lord Birkenhead, who was the Lord Chancellor, and they got on famously.
They're almost two opposites, aren't they? Birkenhead being of Ulster stock, I think.
Yeah, from Liverpool, was sort of the Liverpool area, and
right, via Liverpool. Okay, not of Ulster. So you can tell me.
Well, Andrew Bernard Law was really of Ulster stock. But
was he quite influential with
he
Ulster?
Was, he was Carson's galloper, right? So he sort of inspected the troops for Carson in Ulster. So he was seen as being a real hardliner, and I guess this was Lloyd George's great sort of tactical innovation, in the sense that he gathered around him those that he thought were conspiring against him, but also prominent hardliners, Ulster loyalists like F.E. Smith or Lord Birkenhead. I think what you have to recognise is that before, this is how far this cohort had moved. I mean, not all of them, obviously, but they had moved significantly in terms of being absolutely resistant to Home Rule, to now saying, okay, well, we're actually going to negotiate with the Irish as representatives of a Irish nation, because that's what they said that they were. Although their credentials were never actually accepted, but it was all a bit of a fudge. And they were prepared to give Ireland Dominion status, the 26 counties. They were prepared to give the 26 counties Dominion status. This sea change in the outlook of the Conservatives, which was really tested as well through the treaty negotiations. So first we had Lloyd George getting his cabinet together and making sure that they were all they'd thrashed out, from May to June, July, they'd put together the July proposals, which said to the Irish, right, we want Crown, we want you to accept the Crown, we want you to accept the Empire, and we want defence assurances like, the Navy ports, and then we don't want to coerce Ulster, right? And these are the core of our demands, along with, a whole load of other sort of minor demands that they actually ended up negotiating upon, like financial autonomy, for example. So what Lloyd George did is he got his cabinet to agree to this, and they thrashed that out. And then during the treaty talks, one of the great big tests as to whether the Conservative Party were on board for this substantial change in their Irish policy, and they had that test in Parliament at the end of October, when Lloyd George forced it into a vote of confidence situation, and he won. He won a thumping majority. Then clearly signalling that the whole of the parliamentary party at least were on board with Dominion status and for the terms, or at least exploring, these peace terms for the Irish, for the 26 counties. And then the second major test was when the Conservative Conference Party took place in November, and there was a lot of concern that the Conservative grassroots were really not going to accept any of this, and so there was a lot of effort expended to make sure that the Conservative Party Conference, it wasn't called that then, but Conservative Unionist Association, that a lot of effort went into making sure that the grassroots would support the continuation of the negotiations with Sinn Féin, because of course, don't forget, everyone had looked at them as being, these are insurgents. We shouldn't be negotiating. There was a degree of opinion within the Conservative organisation and party that were completely and emphatically against any negotiations with Sinn Féin, because they wanted them to accept the Crown and the Empire first. We shouldn't be going into these non-conditional negotiations. And also the likes of Leo Amery, for example, would say, well, we should have negotiated with them from a position of strength. We shouldn't be sort of saying, oh, we're at a truce, we're at a standstill, no one's really secured a victory, and yet here we are going into negotiations with essentially what they would have regarded as Irish rebels.
It's interesting that when they do thrash this all about beforehand, and ultimately, I guess the splits that emerge, I guess they were always there, but they were uncovered even more so during the negotiations amongst the Irish contingent.
Yeah. Well, because they hadn't really established their bottom line, and I think I said in this book, they didn't know what success looked like, and there had been a reason, for that, because they, I guess, there is an argument. Well, it was a strategic decision not to thrash out exactly what independence and freedom meant. What were they prepared to fight for, and what weren't they prepared to fight for? Because wouldn't that, of course, have, one, given away what they were looking for, their bargaining chips to the British, and two, it would have potentially collapsed that very fragile unity of the separatist movement. So, De Valera's paramount concern all the time was to try and keep this movement together. And I mean, I don't know whether you want to talk about, the great debate in Ireland has always been, well, why didn't De Valera join the delegation? Because there he was, the most experienced out of all of the Irish revolutionary leaders. Plus, he had also met Lloyd George, and they were effectively, as one of the Doyle-Erin cabinet members said, effectively they're leaving their best player at home, and they're off into the lion's den, if you like, in 10 Downing Street, facing a formidable flanks of negotiators who had decades of parliamentary experience, and then topped by Lloyd George, who was just one of the preeminent negotiators of his time. So it was such a difficult task in any case, and why would they want to handicap themselves further by leaving such, a forceful negotiator himself as De Valera behind? His justification for it was that, well, I'm going to preserve,
because it was ultimately his decision, wasn't it? If he wanted to go to London, he would have.
Yeah, then the cabinet was split as to whether he should go, and his vote was the casting vote, and he said, I'm going to be the symbol of the Republic, the uncontaminated symbol of the Republic, and so the idea would be, okay, that did he deliberately undermine the negotiations, and did he want them to fail so that then he could impose his own solution? And that could have, inevitably, this is the way many people would think about it, that, because there's an awful lot of concentration on the Collins and De Valera dynamic. Collins was obviously De Valera's closest challenger, and this is because De Valera had been away in America for a lot of the War of Independence. So, Collins's profile and had shot up while De Valera was away, and he was the one prosecuting the war effort. It's hard not to assume that De Valera that he was underhand about the whole thing. He never really spelt out what his intentions were. And he was one of the most frustrating characters to deal with in the book. I would read and pore over his words and try and actually work out what on earth he meant. And he would send over these convoluted statements to the delegates in London, saying, perhaps I'll come over, but I probably won't come over. He relied on obfuscation all the time. And the difficulty was, though, that he had hardliners at home, so he was trying to keep them appeased. And in London, he'd sent the moderates. Effectively, the delegation was dominated by moderates. And yeah, it's hard not to wonder what his ulterior motive was, because it seemed to be that he set up his Irish delegation he intended it to be paralysed almost, because against Collins and Griffith, and Eamon Duggan, the lawyer, he's seen as almost like a cipher for Collins. But against him were Robert Barton, Erskine Childers, who was absolutely loathed by the British. And he
was British, wasn't he?
He was, yeah, well, he was born in Mayfair. But he came from an Anglo-Irish background, so the lower...
Yeah, I'm public school educated.
Yeah, Haileybury. He went to the same school as Lionel Curtis. And he went from almost like a conservative view of Ireland, thinking, almost to the extent that he was at the Tory spectrum, and then he went completely to the other side and became this evangelical Republican. And the same can be said. The
fervour of the convert, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And well, the British absolutely loathed him, and that was why they tried to Lloyd George made sure that I think after the 7th, so they had 7 plenary sessions in the treaty talks, and they absolutely got nowhere, which was, De Valera's strategy working to a degree.
But then, does that mean he didn't take the British threat seriously, that they would want war if the talks collapsed?
Yeah. Well, so this is the interesting thing, isn't it? I mean, we'll never know to what degree what he was really thinking during that period. But what we can say is that before the treaty negotiations began, De Valera was very much pushing the moderate line. There were these unending exchanges between Lloyd George and public exchanges of letters between Lloyd George and Eamon de Valera before the treaty negotiations began, just sort of trying to establish the parameters, the talks about the talks, if you like. And Eamon de Valera really very rarely referred to use the word republic. And in the Doyle, he was trying to adjust expectations. Then when the talks got underway, he seemed to want to interfere all the time, even though he had made them plenipotentiaries. The other problem was that by the end of the treaty talks, he was really gung-ho, sort of trying to rouse the population up back to the idea of military conflict, and we have to fight for our freedom and all the rest. And the tenor of his rhetoric was it's extremely belligerent. So he was sort of, rousing everyone to war at the very final, during the final days of the treaty talks, when everything was on the precipice. And he has always been accused, he was attacked for that. Why did you rush back to the Rock of the Republic after you sent the others off to London? And I just wanted as well to say, in terms of the instructions that the Irish delegates had, they were very confused. They were completely contradictory. So they'd been given instructions by the Dáil, but then separate instructions by the cabinet, private instructions by the cabinet, secret instructions, that they were not to make any agreement or make any substantial decision without referring back to the cabinet. So it was all extremely difficult, and this was surely not the way to make sure that negotiations were going to be successful. It seemed to sort of damn them from the outset, didn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, agreement is reached. It is reached with the delegates and the British, but really the key elements that become problematic are Dominion status and Ulster, the status of Ulster, and the Boundary Commission.
Yes,
yeah. Which I know we could spend hours talking about the Boundary Commission. Which
it was a very smart negotiating move by Lloyd George. So Andrew Bonar was actually, when he returned, the one serious threat to Lloyd George as logical replacement to Lloyd George, because the Conservative Party were a little bit tentative about going out on their own, even though they had won, as the khaki election or the coupon election, and they were the dominant force in the coalition. And there was sort of a level or a degree of tentativeness about would they be able to, achieve a sweeping victory and not have to rely on Lloyd George's Liberals. And he was a very charismatic figure, and he did have still a wide popularity, even though that was on the wane, obviously, by the time of the treaty talks. So here is Andrew Bonar comes back as a potential leader. So if Lloyd George fell, the Conservatives knew that they had Andrew Bonar, and he was the one that really he appealed to all sections of the party. He laid down a marker, because effectively what Lloyd George was trying to do was trying to force Ulster's Unionists into this all-Ireland parliament, right? So they would have home rule. Effectively, they would have home rule under Dublin. Lloyd George had already committed to not coercing Ulster, but he was trying to put pressure on them and to say that this is how they wanted to go. Andrew Bonar came in and said, absolutely not. There will be no coercion of Ulster. There will be no deviation from what we have in the Government of Ireland Act, and which is effectively what James Craig, who was the leader of Ulster's Unionists, had said in the summer. He said, tell Lloyd George I'm going to sit on Ulster like a rock. And he had said that to one of the Irish civil servants from Dublin Castle, one of the British civil servants from Dublin Castle. So when Andrew Bonar threw down the gauntlet in this way, saying thus far and no further to Lloyd George, like stop your attempts to try and force Craig and his cabinet into a certain position, then Lloyd George knew categorically that he had to follow a different strategy. But it was quite clear that this was something like this was going to happen. So, I mean, someone of Lloyd George's creativity was never just going to be stumped by that. So he'd already tried to persuade and sound out Griffith and Collins as to whether they would actually accept a boundary commission. And so what happened was that Griffith said, yes, well, I won't stand in your way. And effectively saying, I won't collapse the talks over, you pushing this policy. And key to this, and Collins was very unhappy about it initially, but key to softening up the Sinn Féin, if you like, towards this policy, Tom Jones was absolutely vital in this, and he was the Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet. He was a confidant of Lloyd George. He was also a fellow Welshman. Tom Jones won the confidence. They trusted him to a degree because
he was a bit of a straight shooter, wasn't he?
Straight shooter, yeah. And what is remarkable is that he was going in and out of the Irish camp. But there was no comparable figure going in and out of the British camp. Lloyd George was distrusted by Sinn Féin. No one trusted Lloyd George. But by having Tom Jones, there was this sense of understanding, and Tom Jones could talk their talk. And effectively, what happened was that they had this meeting on the 12th of November, and then Griffith, he didn't read it, but he signed a statement saying that he effectively, agreed not to stand in their way over the Boundary Commission. He didn't tell anyone else about this. except he did tell De Valera that he had had this discussion. So he didn't feel that he needed to disclose any further. He didn't think it was of any note. And what this did, the Boundary Commission effectively, Collins and Griffith, I don't think they would have signed the treaty if they had thought that the Boundary Commission and the intense discussions over this Boundary Commission really carried on right up until the final hours of the treaty. Collins clearly was won over, I think, by that final meeting. But there was this idea that the Boundary Commission would, and the way that Lloyd George sort of fed this idea, he presented the Boundary Commission as something that the Irish could themselves conceive of as the way to achieving essential unity. So he allowed them to think that, but he didn't really spell it out. And of course, the Irish really fell down and not demanding greater detail. And that was Lloyd George's great strength, that he could sort of promise this idea that they were going to achieve their aim, they were going to be able to get essential unity, and effectively that the Protestants, Ulster's Protestants, would be confined to a tiny little area in the northeast, and that ultimately that would not be economically sustainable, and they would wither away, and then they would ultimately join an all-Ireland. Okay, but it didn't come to pass because obviously economic and geographic sort of considerations. Like we won't get too much into the Boundary Commission, but it was the great flaw really was that the Irish didn't determine, they didn't ask the detailed questioning that they should have. And in the treaty debates after the treaty was signed, nobody really seemed to care about it because they thought, that's the Boundary Commission, that's the essential unity element.
Yes, it's barely mentioned, isn't it?
Barely mentioned. Their major concern in the treaty debates were, they were very almost a sort of messianic sort of concern about the oath, and the oath was so important to both the British and the Irish.
The oath to the king.
Yeah. Well, let's remember it's an oath of fidelity first to the Constitution, and then to oath of loyalty to the king, or to the monarch. So it really exposed how Sinn Féin thought of. They never really had a coherent policy for the North. Their whole approach throughout the negotiations was that, God, if the English would just get out of the way, we could solve these problems ourselves. And, really they assumed that once Ulster's Protestants, if they could just sort of get over their pig-headedness, that they would basically wake up to the enlightened self-interest of an all-Ireland, that they could be part of the independent Irish nation.
There's always an assumption that, sorry to interrupt, there's no acknowledgement of what it means to be a unionist. I mean, the clue is being in the name, in that they didn't want to be separate from.
No, and that's Andrew Bernard Law always sort of said that, in fact, I think it was the Home Rule debates that. The third Home Rule debate, that Ireland is not a nation; it's two nations, and so there was always a very much an ingrained sense that the Protestants of Ulster, and this was sort of the unspoken element of the first and second Home Rule Acts. And then it came out, really in the third Home Rule, when of course, the whole parliamentary system was not being able to handle it, that actually they wanted self-determination as well. They felt that their identity was completely overrun by the idea of being part of a predominantly Catholic Ireland. Yeah, and that's what we have today. I mean, that's the same issue that we have today, right? So the unionist community feels very much like their identity is inexorably aligned with the British. That is fundamental to who they are. In a way, we never seem to be able to escape this essential conundrum. It's a very difficult one to resolve.
Yeah, I absolutely, and it certainly won't solve that in the next 5 minutes. But I always feel like the Irish Civil War, which essentially resulted from the treaty, those in favour of the treaty and those against it. It seems to me, given what happened only a generation later in the 1930s, I forget the exact year, I should know this, when Ireland declared itself a republic essentially, and in 1949 then was fully republic. It seems such a waste to have of lives to have a civil war, when if a treaty had been accepted by all sides, an independent Ireland was inevitable. Or is that because I'm looking back and I know that that's what happened? And obviously they didn't know that at the time.
Well, they didn't know that at the time. And I think it's very hard to tell a community, especially when you think about the savagery of the War of Independence. People had died for this cause, and to just simply turn around and say, oh, well, actually, it turns out that what we were fighting for was the right to be part of the British Empire. I mean, that just didn't wash with a large number of people within the separatist movement. There was no expectation at that time. I mean, not even the British expected. The British didn't want the Irish to not be part of the empire. I mean, after the First World War, they were very keen on keeping the empire together, because this was the basis of their superpower status, and they had won the First World War, and their effort in the First World War was so defined by the fact that the empire had come together in a way, if you like, and that they had no interest whatsoever in imagining that Ireland would become a republic. And in fact, that's what they tried to fight against. And it took really, as you know, that I'm sure much better than I do. I mean, it all began to fall apart after the Second World War. But certainly after the First World War, there was no willingness at all. I mean, the idea of the empire, the unity of the empire, the majority of British people thought that was a good thing, and liberals and conservatives wanted Ireland to be a dominion. Dominion governments wanted Ireland to be a dominion. The Americans wanted Ireland to be a dominion. So, and yes, you look back and think, oh, well, did it need all of that violence? Did it need all of that bloodletting? It's, and certainly the Civil War is seen as that. It's seen as almost a descent into madness. And it really, it hardened British attitudes against the Irish again. And it also bewildered their supporters across the empire, across the Commonwealth as well. They had the worst of starts, didn't they, the Irish Free State. Having said that, they were an incredibly cohesive and strong democracy. If you think about what had happened to Ireland throughout that revolutionary period, from the Easter Rising, the War of Independence, and then the Civil War. During that interwar period, many new democracies collapsed. They didn't survive. Ireland did. And of course, as I say this, I'm always thinking, oh yes, but there's so many people that, my God, they gave up. That they shouldn't have conceded to the British. They should have kept going.
Life is a compromise, I always think, but then that's just me.
I know a lot of historians would say to a room of students, would you have signed the treaty if you were in this situation? Would you? And always a majority of people say, yes, I would have signed the treaty. But
that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, because they know what comes afterwards, right?
Yeah.
But
they did. I mean, the Dáil did sign the treaty, and the Civil War still happened.
Only by a narrow margin, and then precipitated a civil war. But that civil war, with the conflicts were inherent within the movement, you could argue, and it seems right to argue that to what extent was there ever, after the War of Independence, was there ever going to be a way of persuading the majority of the separatist movement, the volunteers, and the Sinn Féin politicians? How were you going to get both the militarists and the sort of more moderates to agree to this? It's a very difficult thing to do, to actually say, let's compromise after you've suffered all these casualties, you've suffered all this death. Collins was right. The treaty gave the Irish the freedom to achieve freedom.
Yes. A very good way to end it, I think, Gretchen. But I know that we probably could have spoken for another hour and 20 minutes or so. It could speak about this for a very, very long time.
It's a very difficult topic to talk about, to be honest, because it's so current. So yeah, it's a fiendishly complex and very sensitive topic. And as an Australian, I just kind of trample on in.
Yeah, well, no, I think you've done a great job. I've really enjoyed reading it. I've taken up enough of your time, Gretchen.
Yeah.
I would love to be able to get you back on to talk more about Irish history. It's been really interesting.
Okay. Oh no, well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this, and I hope that I hope I got across some points well, and yeah.
You did, absolutely, and it is a complex subject, and I'll put some links in the show notes for our listeners so that they can find out more if they want to. I listened to a very good podcast series with Michael Laffan that's available through.
Great.
Yeah, he's great. He's got a very good sense of humour. Big fan of his.
Oh, well, he's a professor at UCD. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'll put some links in there for that. That covers the whole of the Irish Revolution from Home Rule in the late 19th century all the way up until the Civil War. But Gretchen, your book, The Treaty, The Gripping Story of the Negotiations that brought about the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Well, that's not the full subtitle. The Gripping Story of Negotiations that brought about Irish independence and led to the Civil War. The Treaty, fantastic book. I recommend it. It's what's great about it is that it covers the whole treaty negotiations, but also important facets of the revolution in only 250 pages. So very well done.
Thanks, Oliver.
Well, there was certainly a lot there, but it really is worth reading into more. You can find links in the show notes. If you have any questions or feedback, you can get me on the Twitter or email us at history@aspectsofhistory.com. I'll leave you now. Thank you and good night.